I'm Becca, and this is Deadly Truths. Tonight, we're going back to April 1950, the night two of Kansas City's most powerful men walked into a political clubhouse and never walked out again. Charles Mad Dog Gargotta, the enforcer feared across the North End. Charles Binaggio, the political kingmaker who thought he could bend the whole city to his will. Hours later, both were found executed. 8 shots, 2 bodies, 0 witnesses. The murder shattered Kansas City's political machine, triggered a federal firestorm, and forced the national mafia to tighten its grip on the Midwest. This wasn't a random hit. It was a purge, calculated, sanctioned, and meant to send a message. This is the story of how Kansas City's underworld erased 2 of its own, and this is Deadly Truths. When police stepped into the First Ward Democratic Club at 126 West 5th Street on the morning of April 6, 1950, they walked into a crime scene that was as controlled as it was brutal. The club wasn't a dive bar or a social lounge. It was a political headquarters, a place where precinct captains, ward bosses, and mob-linked operatives handled the business of Kansas City's First Ward. The building sat in the North End, the stronghold of Italian families and the historic base of the Kansas City Mafia. Anyone who walked through those doors at night was either trusted or escorted. At approximately 7 a.m., the cleaning woman unlocked the door and immediately saw Gargotta's body on the floor near the entrance. He was positioned close to the front doorway, as if he'd either been ambushed as he walked in or was trying to reach the exit when he was killed. Just a few steps deeper into the room sat Charles Binaggio, the political boss whose influence had stretched from local gambling parlors to the State House. He was slumped in his chair behind his desk, still seated upright, showing no signs of defensive wounds or struggle. Both men had been shot 4 times in the head with a .32 caliber revolver, a classic mob signature for an internal purge. The shots were close range, tightly grouped, and delivered with precision. There were no shell casings indicating the killers used revolvers. There were no witnesses, no neighbors reporting gunfire, and no signs of forced entry. The club was undisturbed, no drawers pulled out, no papers scattered, no overturned furniture. This wasn't a robbery, a scramble, or a fight. It was an execution carried out in a place the victims believed was safe. The First Ward Democratic Club wasn't neutral ground. It was their turf. Binaggio, in particular, had nearly unlimited access there. Whoever killed them either had a key, was already inside, or was someone both men were willing to meet in private, late at night, without backup. The locked door in the morning confirms something even more telling. Whoever left last had the authority to lock up. Based on body temperature estimates and the cleaner's arrival time, police pinned the killings to the very early hours, likely between 1 and 3 a.m. This was consistent with the timing of political and mob meetings where sensitive business was often handled after the public had gone home. Responding officers quickly realized they weren't dealing with a street hit. The precision of the shots, the lack of noise complaints, and the absence of fingerprints or footprints made it clear that professional killers had been sent to remove 2 major figures. The scene said everything. This was a purge executed by people who knew the layout, knew the victims, and knew exactly how to vanish before sunrise. To understand why these 2 men ended up face down in a Democratic clubhouse, you have to understand who they were and why their deaths sent shockwaves from Kansas City to Washington, D.C. Let's start with the obvious. These weren't small-time crooks. They weren't running nickel slot machines out of basements or shaking down corner stores. They were major players at the exact moment Kansas City's mob was trying to evolve from street-level violence into a polished, politically integrated, organized crime syndicate. Charles Vincenzo Binaggio wasn't just a gangster, he was the mob's political investment strategy. Born in 1907, raised in the North End, he understood early that Kansas City's real power wasn't just in guns, it was in votes, appointments, and who controlled the police board. By the 1940s, Binaggio had positioned himself as the bridge between organized crime and the Democratic Party machine. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't a street fighter. He was the guy who could walk into a room of politicians and convince them the mob's support was a civic duty. He backed candidates for sheriff, county offices, and statewide positions. He allegedly pushed for control of the Missouri Highway Patrol. He was tied to gambling revenue, bookmaking, and political patronage networks. His rise paralleled the weakening of the old Pendergast machine, and he intended to replace it. He was the guy who figured out that if you control the meeting minutes, you don't need to break kneecaps. Just pave the roads, shake the hands, and make sure your friends get elected. Efficient, low drama, but power makes enemies. And when you start mixing mob money with state-level politics, the National Mafia Commission tends to pay attention, usually the bad kind. If Binaggio was the political mind, Gargotta was the blunt instrument. Born in 1900 in Sicily, he came to Kansas City young and immediately made his reputation the old-fashioned way, by shooting people repeatedly, and somehow rarely doing meaningful prison time for it. Verified history. He was arrested over 100 times. He beat so many cases that newspapers openly mocked the court system. In 1933, he shot and nearly killed a police officer, only to have the bullets disappear from evidence. He openly ran gambling operations, extortion rackets, and political intimidation schemes. He was the guy everyone hated but nobody wanted to fire because he knew where all the bodies were buried and helped bury half of them. Despite his record, Gargotta walked around Kansas City like a man who believed the law didn't apply to him. And honestly, for decades, it didn't. Judges were connected, witnesses recanted, police chiefs were beholden to political bosses aligned with the mob. But by 1950, Gargotta had a problem. The world had changed, but he hadn't. The FBI was watching, the Kefauver committee was forming, and the national mob wanted less noise, not a one-man crime opera drawing headlines every time he fired a pistol. He was old school in a new era, and that is usually fatal. Binaggio and Gargotta formed a rare partnership, the strategist and the soldier. One built influence in the capital, the other enforced influence on the street. Together, they represented Kansas City's attempt to modernize its criminal empire, to fuse political power with underworld muscle so tightly that you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. But their ambition had two major consequences. They attracted national attention, not the good kind. Congressional committees, federal prosecutors, East Coast bosses. Everyone was starting to look west and ask why Kansas City was suddenly trying to run the show. Binaggio failed to deliver certain political outcomes he had promised the national mafia structure. That kind of failure gets people replaced quickly, quietly, permanently. They basically tried to install their own operating system inside the political machine. But the Mafia Commission was still running Windows 95 and did not approve the update. Binaggio and Gargotta weren't killed because they were criminals. They were killed because they were ambitious criminals who started believing they were bigger than the organization that created them. And when you start outgrowing your usefulness in the mob, someone decides you don't need to grow anymore. By early 1950, both Charles Binaggio and Charles Mad Dog Gargotta were standing on a fault line. The ground was shifting under them, and everyone except them seemed to notice. Kansas City was no longer a local mob playground. It was being watched, scrutinized, and documented. And the two men who once thrived in the shadows were suddenly sitting under a national spotlight. This is the part of the story where everything starts to tighten. Political pressure, mob pressure, federal pressure, all crushing them from different directions. This is the big one, and it's fully documented. Binaggio promised the national mafia leadership that he could deliver unprecedented political control in Missouri. He supported Forrest Smith's campaign for governor, riding a wave of political influence across Kansas City and St. Louis. The mob expected that once Smith was in office, Binaggio would secure control over key state positions. especially the Missouri Highway Patrol Board, which regulated gambling enforcement. Why did this matter? Because controlling the highway patrol meant controlling raids, investigations, and the stability of statewide betting operations. But once Smith took office, he refused to give Binaggio's faction the positions they expected. He didn't appoint their candidate. He didn't give the mob control. He didn't play ball. That failure wasn't just embarrassing in the Mafia's logic, it was a contractual breach, the kind you don't survive. Binaggio told the Mafia Commission he'd get the keys to the building. He got inside, found out the locks were changed, and the boss told him to come home without them. You don't show up empty-handed. For years, Kansas City protected Gargotta like a glitch in the system nobody wanted to fix. He beat charges, overturned convictions, walked out of courtrooms as if judges were on retainer. But by 1950, the environment had changed. Federal investigators were digging through his case history. The infamous 1935 political murder trial he once beat was back under scrutiny. Crime reporters were openly calling out corruption tied to his freedom. His presence made Kansas City look dirty, and not in the harmless Midwest vice way, in the national organized crime kind of way. The mob wanted less noise, not a walking billboard for corruption. Gargotta, by simply existing, was inviting trouble. This part is backed by multiple historical analyses. After World War II, organized crime across the U.S. was consolidating. The Mafia Commission in New York, the entity that oversaw national policy, was trying to streamline operations in cities like Kansas City, Chicago, St. Louis, and Detroit. They wanted stability, predictability, profit, no headlines. Binaggio and Gargotta delivered the exact opposite. High-profile arrests, political scandals, broken promises on securing state control, and increasing attention from Washington. The commission wanted the Midwest to run smooth like a rotary phone. Instead, KC was becoming a dial-up connection constantly ringing with federal agents, journalists, and angry state officials. In 1950, Senator Estes Kefauver launched a national investigation into organized crime. Missouri, especially Kansas City, was on the radar. This terrified mob leaders. Binaggio and Gargotta were both already connected to political scandals being whispered in Jefferson City and Washington. Their visibility was now a liability. Investigators saw them as entry points to crack open the Kansas City Mafia's political machine. Killing them before the hearings began wasn't just punishment, it was damage control. The local faction aligned with older, more cautious leadership believed Binaggio's political ambition was dangerous. They didn't want the kind of exposure he attracted. They didn't want state-level wars. They didn't want federal investigators digging through decades of KC's corruption. Gargotta's presence only made things worse. He represented the old Pendergast era. Loud, violent, sloppy. Binaggio represented the risky new era. Bold, ambitious, and too visible. Both men had become symbols of the exact problems the national mafia wanted to eliminate. Not a single credible historian disputes this. By spring 1950, Binaggio and Gargotta were already dead men walking. They failed to deliver political power. They attracted too much attention. They were liabilities to the National Commission. And they represented two eras of KC crime that no longer fit the strategic direction of organized crime in America. When the order finally came down, whether from St. Louis, Chicago, New York, or a combination, it wasn't impulsive. It was administrative, a correction, an internal restructuring, mafia style. Corporate sent an email, "We're downsizing." And KC's First Ward Democratic Club became the conference room. By the time the sun set on April 5th, 1950, both Charles Binaggio and Charles Mad Dog Gargotta were moving through Kansas City as if it were any other night. But the political ground beneath them had shifted, and someone had already decided this was the night it ended. The timeline below is reconstructed from police reports, investigative summaries, and verified historical accounts. Nothing added, nothing dramatized. It was late evening, April 5th, 1950. The men arrived together. Sometime late in the evening, Binaggio and Gargotta arrived at the First Ward Democratic Club, located at 126 West 5th Street in Kansas City. It was a building both men frequented and trusted, a political headquarters as much as a mob social hub. Important factual point: there were no signs of forced entry. That means they unlocked the building themselves or someone they trusted let them in. Either option shows this was not an ambush by strangers. It was a meeting. They entered the club room. The last time they're seen alive. The club was quiet, closed to the public. This was not a place where people wandered in off the street. When they entered, Binaggio took his usual seat behind his desk. Gargotta remained closer to the entrance, consistent with his role as muscle and watchman. This detail matters because their final positions match exactly where their bodies were found. Police found no signs of struggle, surprise, or defensive wounds. Given the layout, if the killers had burst in suddenly, Gargotta, known for quick violence bits, would have reacted. Instead, he was taken down before reaching the door. This points to the most logical interpretation supported by evidence. The killers were either already inside waiting or walked in with no resistance because the victims believed they were allies. This matches standard historical patterns for internal mob purges. The execution: 8 shots, no misses, no hesitation. Both men were killed with .32 caliber revolvers, each taking 4 shots to the head. Binaggio, still seated behind his desk, shot from behind, close range, no struggle, no movement. This indicates he was likely distracted, perhaps reading a document, speaking with someone, or leaning forward. Gargotta, found near the doorway, also shot 4 times in the head. Body position indicated he may have stood or turned too late. He had no chance to fight back. No casings were found at the scene, confirming revolvers, the weapon of choice for mob executions due to their silence and lack of ejecta. The grouping of the bullets, tight, consistent, controlled, indicates trained shooters who had done this before. Multiple newspapers and police notes confirm no neighbors reported shots. No one heard a struggle. No suspicious activity was reported overnight. A .32 revolver doesn't produce the thunder of a .45 or 9 millimeter, but it's still audible. Unless the building is well insulated, the shots were fired quickly in succession. The killers left immediately, and the neighborhood was accustomed to late-night activity. In the North End, people minded their business. Silence helps an execution disappear. When the cleaning woman arrived at 7 a.m., she unlocked the door. Inside, the room was undisturbed. Nothing was ransacked. No valuables were touched. The bodies were exactly where they fell. There were no bloody footprints or smears indicating removal of evidence. Most important fact: the killers locked the building on their way out. That means they had a key, or Binaggio or Gargotta locked the door when they let the killers in, meaning the murderers simply walked out. Either scenario confirms this was an inside job, carried out by people who knew exactly what they were doing. There was no rush, no panic, no sloppiness, just a clean departure after a precise double execution. At 7 a.m., the cleaning woman entered and saw Gargotta first. He was lying on the floor near the door. Binaggio remained seated behind the desk. 4 neat bullet wounds in the back of his head. She called police immediately. The responding officers instantly recognized the gravity of the crime. This wasn't a warning. This was a removal. Every physical detail of the crime scene tells the same story. Binaggio and Gargotta walked in willingly. They trusted the people they met. They were killed quickly and professionally. No valuables were touched. No items were taken. No fight occurred. The killers didn't rush. They locked up behind themselves. Everything points to an organized, approved internal mafia elimination, carried out with absolute efficiency. And that's not speculation. That's the only conclusion supported by the documented evidence. The murders of Charles Binaggio and Charles Mad Dog Gargotta detonated through Kansas City's political and criminal worlds like a hand grenade, the kind where everyone pretends they didn't see who threw it. What followed wasn't a whodunit. It was a don't say anything about it. Here's how the aftermath unfolded and why it exposed more about the system than the killers. When police arrived at the First Ward Democratic Club, they weren't walking into a puzzle. They were walking into a statement, and everyone already knew what it meant. But here's what they did: interviewed known associates, documented the scene, rounded up usual suspects, pretended briefly that city leadership actually wanted answers. Here's what they found: no fingerprints, no weapon, no witnesses, no forced entry, no motive anyone was willing to speak on. And here's what they actually concluded: nothing, absolutely nothing. It was like trying to solve who finished the last of the office coffee. Everyone knows, but nobody's naming names because we all still work here. The case went cold immediately. Kansas City PD didn't have suspects. They had shrugs. The double murder wasn't just a mob event. It exposed just how intertwined Kansas City politics and organized crime had become. Binaggio wasn't merely a mob boss. He was a kingmaker, and the guy politicians hoped wouldn't call them at home. His death ripped the cover off the city's political machine. Key fallout: state officials panicked, AMD local office holders avoided the press. Political allies began distancing themselves, and the Democratic Party in Kansas City fractured internally. Journalists finally said out loud what everyone already knew: the mob owned parts of the city's political structure. This wasn't a scandal, it was an audit. Then enter the Kefauver Committee. The national spotlight locks onto Kansas City. Just months after the murders, Senator Estes Kefauver launched a nationwide investigation into organized crime. Kansas City was no longer a regional story. It was a national example of how deeply crime families could infiltrate government. The committee hearings exposed gambling kickbacks, police corruption, political machine dealings, mob money in elections, the failure of local law enforcement to control organized crime. And crucially, they named both Binaggio and Gargotta as central figures in KC's criminal political structure. Their murders became Exhibit A for how the mob punishes failure, how political corruption protects organized crime, how local law enforcement avoids stepping on the wrong shoes. Millions of Americans watched the hearings on live television, the first major true crime broadcast in U.S. history. It was the 1950 version of a Netflix docuseries where everyone suddenly realizes the nice local guy was running a criminal enterprise the whole time. So why no one was ever charged? The four-part reality check. Witnesses were non-existent. Everyone who might have talked either wasn't there or pretended they weren't breathing that night. Evidence was spotless. Revolvers leave no casings, no fingerprints, no footprints, nothing disturbed. It was a surgical hit, not a bar fight. Charging someone meant dragging the entire political machine into court. No one wanted that. Kansas City needed the story to disappear. Multiple historians agree. The order did not come from inside Kansas City. It came from above. When the National Mafia Commission greenlights a purge, nobody testifies, nobody investigates deeply, and nobody prosecutes. The murders weren't unsolved in the sense of mystery. They were unsolved in the sense of mutual agreement. It was less cold case and more don't touch the thermostat. After the murders, Kansas City reorganized its leadership. The mob took a quieter, more disciplined direction. Political influence didn't vanish, it just became less obvious. Federal surveillance permanently increased, and KC became one of the FBI's priority cities for decades. Binaggio and Gargotta didn't just die. Their deaths reset the Kansas City mob. No one was ever charged because the killers were trusted insiders. The weapons were clean, the scene was controlled, the victims were liabilities, and the political establishment needed silence more than justice. This wasn't a failure of detective work. It was a demonstration of power, and one the city understood perfectly. The murders of Charles Binaggio and Charles Mad Dog Gargotta weren't just a violent exit for two powerful men, they were a structural correction for the Kansas City mob and a national wake-up call about organized crime in America. This is what actually changed, according to documented history. Before 1950, the KC mob operated with a loud, politically entangled bravado. After the murders, the organization shifted toward a quieter, more centralized, and more cautious model of operation. Historians agree the murders effectively ended the era of flashy political ambition inside Kansas City's underworld. Multiple sources confirm that the 1950 killings reflected and reinforced external control. This was a turning point. After 1950, Kansas City became a reliable satellite in the national organized crime network, not an independent political wildcard. The April 1950 murders became a key talking point in the Kefauver hearings later that same year. Factual impacts: senators cited the killings as proof of the mob's ability to infiltrate government. KC was highlighted as one of the most politically compromised cities in the country. Testimony connected gambling, union influence, and political corruption directly to organized crime structures. Millions of Americans watched the hearings, making Kansas City one of the most publicly scrutinized mob cities in the nation. The murders helped trigger decades of federal attention. Documented facts: the FBI elevated Kansas City as a priority target city for mob surveillance. Federal wiretapping increased in the 1950s to 1970s. The Kansas City family became one of the most investigated crime organizations in the Midwest. These decades of pressure eventually contributed to major convictions in the 1970s and 1980s. Notably, the Stardust Skim investigations involving Las Vegas casinos. Without the 1950 killings drawing national focus, the intensity of that surveillance likely would have been delayed. The First Ward political structure that Binaggio had relied on did not survive his death. The murders were not just a mob reset, they were a political reset. Historians agree on this point. The 1950 double homicide became one of the clearest examples of the American Mafia eliminating its own leadership for failing politically, attracting federal attention, and refusing to operate within national boundaries. Kansas City's organized crime family carried the lesson forward. Stay useful, stay quiet, stay aligned with national directives, or you end up like Binaggio and Gargotta. This wasn't myth, this was precedent. The legacy of the April 1950 murders is not two bodies in a political clubhouse. It is the transformation of an entire criminal ecosystem. Their deaths were not the end of the Kansas City mob. They were the blueprint for what it became. When people talk about Kansas City's mob history, the 1950 murders of Charles Binaggio and Charles Mad Dog Gargotta aren't just another pair of bodies in a long criminal timeline. They're a turning point, a moment when the veneer of political respectability finally cracked and the country saw what had been hiding underneath. What these murders revealed is simple, factual, and deeply uncomfortable. Kansas City wasn't just dealing with organized crime. Kansas City was organized crime, politically, financially, structurally. They showed how tightly woven the threads were between crime and government, not just in Kansas City, but across the United States. And the aftermath proves something even more significant. When organized crime decides someone has become a liability, the removal is immediate, clean, and permanent, even at the highest levels of political power. This was not a rogue act. This was organizational maintenance. Their murders didn't dismantle the machine, and they simply forced it to evolve. The mob retreated from public political battles. The political machine fractured under its own weight. Federal investigators learned to follow the money and the silence. And Kansas City's name became permanently engraved in the national story of organized crime and corruption. Even today, these killings are studied because they cut straight to the core truth. Power doesn't disappear. It relocates, and silence is often the loudest evidence. You've been listening to Deadly Truths with Becca. If this story pulled you in, hit follow, rate, and share. It helps keep these forgotten histories alive and sharp. Research and narration are always done by me. Sources for this episode include the Mob Museum, Crime Magazine, Contemporary Reporting, FBI files, and the official records of the Kefauver Committee. And remember, the past isn't dead, it's just doing time at the murder factory.